Welcome to the Why We Fight Boot Camp. This is our first Spaces, official Spaces. Today is June 30th, 2024. I'm your host, Justin Stam, and we are going to be discussing kind of a hot topic and a confusing topic because everybody thinks they know what it means, and yet they can't explain it, most people. So we're going to try to tackle that today and have an open discussion about things. And that talk will be about what is Christian nationalism, its philosophical origins, and the multiple opposing worldviews that we have to constantly wrestle with. So we're going to have opening prayer first because we are primarily Christian, like we said before. And we'll have Servium go ahead and do opening prayer.
Nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Come, Holy Ghost, fill the hearts of thy faithful, and kindle in them the fire of thy love. Send forth thy Spirit, and they shall be created, and thou shalt renew the face of the earth. O God, who didst instruct the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Ghost, grant that, by the same Spirit, we may be truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation, through the same Christ our Lord. O Christ Jesus, I acknowledge thee as universal King. All that has been made has been created for thee. Exercise over me all thy rights. I renew my baptismal promises. I renounce Satan, his pomps, and his works, and I promise to live a good Christian life. In particular, I pledge myself to labor to the best of my ability for the triumph of the rights of God and of thy church. Ave Maria, gratia plena Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et hora mortis nostrae. Amen. Nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancti.
Amen. Hail Christ.
Hail Mary.
Hail Mary.
What is Christian nationalism? Its philosophical origins and the multiple opposing worldviews. The worst mistake most make when they approach this subject and the subject of politics in general is not having at least a cursory knowledge of philosophy. Without it, you won't truly understand anything, really, anything at all, let alone understand political philosophy. You can't have a level of certainty and predictability. I cannot underestimate the importance of understanding the laws of logic, the three laws of logic, to tackle this subject too. Primarily the law of identity. Why? Because if I was asked as a Catholic, or I asked a friend that's an Orthodox, or I asked a friend that's a Protestant, what do you mean by Christian nationalism? They're going to give me three different explanations. There has to be a singular principle of unity. Now, everybody wrestles with that, say in Orthodoxy, they wrestle because not everybody's in agreement on the particulars of their theology, let alone the implementation, their praxis, their implementation of their politic, their protectionism of their worldview, of their values, of their virtues, their culture. That's the same thing we face in the West as Western men, whether you're Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, or just a non-denominational Christian. If you identify as Christian, you have your own arbitrary autonomy of man definition of what Christian means within Christian nationalism. And even nationalism is oftentimes misinterpreted. So without committing to saying, I am a Christian nationalist, we're going to just objectively describe and objectively discuss what these categories are that become this system of thought. All worldviews, all belief systems, all philosophies are that system of thought, are a system of thought. And it's important to understand that within each system of thought, it doesn't just come with one particular truth. One truth doesn't stand on its own. It is existing with preconditions of other truths, and those truths together make a total worldview. Pragmatically explained, that means that if you're talking to somebody about, for instance, a car that's never been to Earth or has never seen a car, or they came from 5,000 years ago, and you tell them get in the car and drive down the road, that presupposes they understand what a car is or what driving and what going down the road means. If you tell them to put gas in the car, that presupposes they understand the necessity of gas and that the car that they just found out what it is needs that gas. So that is a perfect example of a demonstration of a system of thought, a total understanding of things. You have to have these preconditions understood. And that's why it's important to have a basic understanding of philosophy. And I don't just mean any philosophy. I mean a complete philosophy that is not bastardized like modernist philosophies. The modernist philosophies that delve into monism, monism, atomism, dualism, pragmaticism. And those are in direct opposition to the Christian worldview, especially the Catholic worldview, right? So in doing so, when one does describe his own personal worldview, not that it's your personal worldview, but if a Catholic describes what his personal worldview of Christianity is, and he wants to implement that through any form of politics, you don't even have to call it national, just in general, any kind of politics. It's going, and it must represent his virtues, his values, his beliefs, his morals, his ethics. Now, what happens if you talk to a person that's a Protestant that believes once saved, always saved, and I can sin all I want because I'll never lose my salvation? What kind of politic will that produce? What kind of a social environment will that produce? And more importantly, will it be in opposition to a Catholic Christian nationalism, Christian politic? Of course it will. Of course it will, and it does. So it's not that there is no bridging the gap with these worldviews, because no matter what denomination you're part of, you are targeted for eradication. The modern world does not want Christianity of any sort, and it surely doesn't want the Western man of any sort. We've already established that. We know that. We already can presuppose that. If you're in a chat like this and learning about this, you already should know that. So laying that foundation of understanding some particular notions and characteristics of Christianity generally, Catholicism generally, and nationalism generally will help you to understand and make sense of this interpretive Wild West term of Christian nationalism, right? So anybody that's actually tried to understand the opposing worldviews of Christianity, the opposing worldviews and philosophies of Catholic, let's just say Catholic integralism. In fact, one can actually equivocate integralism, which is a very old interpretation and an old of the implementation of Catholic politics, right? Rather than nationalism. So when one says Catholic nationalism, he would just simply say that because that's a colloquial term that people understand in the modern day, right? But integralism is probably what they're trying to convey. So when we say integralism, what exactly does that mean? Integralism, as we've said in other talks and other places we've talked about before, we've done before, is that when your politics comes from your culture and your culture comes from the virtues that are a shared principle of unity within that culture that creates that defined culture. That doesn't necessarily speak to a nation, but how can a culture exist unless it exists in a nation? So of course it does. So the culture is not going to produce a politic that is diametrically opposed to it or believes in this myth of neutrality promoted by democracy. I am Catholic, but I don't care if anybody, even if they're not from my country and they're an atheist, becomes the president and take over all of the Congress for my country. That's lunacy. Of course, you want to, even with force if necessary, protect the continuity of your culture that is Catholic. You do the same thing if you were in a Buddhist nation. Everybody knows that. It's a self-evident truth of survival. Even an atheist would recognize that. And ironically, atheists like Richard Dawkins recognize the fact that you have to maintain the cultural integrity of a Christian nation that he says he enjoys the culture of. But yet he doesn't want to commit to the belief system of it. So how can one stay in the fight of defending a thing if they don't really believe and love that thing? You just love the byproduct or the accidentals of the worldview of Christianity. but you're not committed to protecting the unchangeable principles, right? And that's what we care about, is protecting the unchangeable principles. So in short, to give a basic understanding before moving on to the next subject, people want a straight, pragmatic, just get to the point, give me a straight answer what Christian nationalism is. Well, guess what? It's actually interpretive, just like monarchism is interpretive. Can you have monarchism in a Buddhist country, in a Hindu country? Yes. Can you have it in a Christian country? Yes. Muslim country? Yes. So when you say monarchism, you have to understand in the context of who's saying it. So if a Catholic is saying it, it means he wants a Catholic monarch. It's a baby can figure this out, obviously. But it has to be done, once again, has to be known within other truths or statements, the system of thought. A Catholic monarch will protect Catholicism. He will not be ambivalent towards it. He will not believe in this myth of neutrality where he doesn't care what happens to his own people and his nation and his historical legacy and so forth, right? Now, monarchism is not the only method of administrating a particular political philosophy, such as integralism. But there is a difference between political philosophy and the politic or the political party or the politician. People always confuse these things together. Integralism is not a political party. Integralism is a political philosophy, and it can give birth and impetus to politicians and political parties that don't bear any similarity or name at all. And it's the same thing when you say Christian nationalism. It just simply means you want those virtues and values as much as possible to be implemented into your public policy. That's really, really what it means. Can you have Christian nationalism or Catholic Christian integralism in a republic? Certainly you can. Anybody that's actually read Republic, when Socrates goes through his dialogues with the young budding philosophers he's trying to win over from their sophistry, he makes it very clear. The city on the shining hill should be ruled over by a king. That's a monarchy, a philosopher king, or a king and a philosopher. So if you have a philosopher king and he's Catholic, that's still a republic. The method and how the king is chosen is different. He's elected, not necessarily a succession of blue bloods, or whatever one wants to describe them as, aristocratic succession. But one would expect one to know what to do. You can't just take the farmer and put him into the hospital like the communists did, and then take the doctors and put them out into the fields, because people died in the emergency room and the people starved because they didn't have anything to eat from the farm because they were fish out of water. That's a perfect example. So it's important to understand the political philosopher seeks the most ideal implementation and expression of his worldview. The politician seeks to bridge that pragmatic implementation of those greatest ideals. And if he gets 50% or less of his ideas into reality, he's still ahead of the game because he started out with an extremely high ideal rather than chasing the democratic process, as we all know. The democratic process, as described by Plato, Plato's Republic, is the type of person that births a bronze class society. He described the bronze class, the silver class, and the gold class. And the bronze class were those driven by the most base desires and controlled by their passions. The money changers, the criminals, the liars, the cheats, right? And then, of course, he described the silver class, which are the guardians. And everybody within a society is a guardian. You're charged with, just like we are charged with, the protection and continuity of our culture, right? And that's what we don't see a lot of. There seems to be a giant wall between, because of this whole idea of the separation of church and state concept, that you can't try to protect your Christian identity within the public space. You should not. And that's been a huge problem promoted by non-Catholics and so forth. And of course, you have the gold society. And the gold society is where the king and the philosopher, the aristocrats and the philosophers will come into play, right? So it's important to understand that. So the philosopher would be like the political philosopher, like Aristotle was with Alexander the Great, and be discussing things with also the implementation of these policies coming from this philosophical worldview to the Senate That's how it would work. So yes, you can have a republic, and you can have a monarchy, and you can have nationalist identity. So that's basically that section. So we're going to cover what is Christian nationalism in general, right? And so before I go into the philosophical origins, I think it's important to discuss the multiple opposing worldviews that are ensnaring a lot of people while they're still claiming to be Christian. But before I go on, is there any questions about that first section? Okay. So the opposing worldviews. So when one dips his finger into the philosophical world, he can see a stark contrast from even the Enlightenment era philosophers, definitely from the Middle Age philosophers. But when you go all the way back to ancient Greece, you see a repeating process of four major categories of worldviews that are opposed to the Christian Catholic worldview. And they basically fall into, well, let me just describe them initially. So the first worldview that that many of the pre-Socratic philosophers believed in, like Parmenides, who really began this concept, was monism. And of course, spiritual monism is a concept that there's only one substance in the universe, kind of like Hinduism, right? And we're not really here. Since there can be no change in the universe, there's only one substance to remain unchanged. So therefore, there's no human nature. There's no katholikos, as Plato said, which would be the universal forms of all things, planets, giraffes, humans. There's no such thing as universal forms. There's only one. And that spiritual oneness makes everything that we see here as a simulation, illusory, and not real. Okay. The second worldview is dualism. And the easiest way to implement or describe the manifestation of dualism is Plato's Republic. And for the East, it would be the Daiji or yin yang symbol in Taoism, right? And that would be there are two co-eternal equals, two co-eternal equal substances, one that's uncreated and one that opposes the spiritual substance, right? And both are co-eternal, though. So some worldviews say that the created substances, like the deities and the humans, are created, yet they exist eternally from a substance separate from the eternal Tao. Very odd. Well, Plato really describes the great monad, and it's not a person in this dualistic worldview. It is a divine essence, okay? And this divine essence possesses all the forms of things in his mind, in which he called the logos, right? And he maintains the uniformity of nature from outside of time and space, outside of the world of forms. But the cycle of the universe destroys everything. Sinner, murderer, and saint all alike end up, even if they break out of transmigration, reincarnation, they end up annihilated. But their substance left over is what is used to make the new forms and the new things in the next cycle of the cosmos. Okay, that's dualism. There's other examples and other branches within dualism, but we can go on to the third one, which is atomism. Okay, and atomism is a concept where there is no great monad. There is nothing after this life. There's only this life and this world and this substance and this material world, and there ain't nothing else. Okay, so they don't believe in eternal forms. And some sects of atomism believe in basically two major branches. One is a deterministic worldview and one that possesses a free will, which is kind of odd because if you're part of a predetermined outcome of atoms falling through space, not atoms as in the modern use of the scientific term, but particles that fall through space that give the illusion of form, then really you don't have personhood because you don't have form at all. So how can you have will without personhood and identity? So this atomistic worldview has crept its way into the modern era and has influenced people like David Hume and Karl Marx. Karl Marx believed in a deterministic nature of these atoms or atomism of the material substance throughout the history of mankind, and it's been evolving towards a utopian outcome through a dialectical materialistic tension. So don't think that these crazy ideas died in the ancient time period. They worked their way back in as soon as Western civilization, right around the Enlightenment era, began to abandon deeper understandings of Catholic philosophy, like St. John of Damascus, like Thomas Aquinas, like St. Justin Martyr, Augustine. They began redeveloping these Gnostic concepts again and tried to interpret them into a Christian worldview. And when they failed at that, they abandoned the Christian worldview and stuck with anything other than that, really. I mean, when you look at Schopenhauer, he was depressed and almost committed suicide. And he says that studying Buddhism is what saved his life. But Buddhism believes in the same dualistic concept that you're going to end up annihilated at the end of the cosmic age. So what is there to look forward to? Why not, like Epicurus said, live for today? Because Epicurus was at that point too. There's no life after this, so live for today. Why shouldn't I F people up and take their stuff? Well, I go to jail. So what? Then I die. Then what? Well, what if I'm a saint? You still end up annihilated. So why would Schopenhauer and other Enlightenment era and even German philosophers believe in such tripe? Because they didn't know what a true, congruent, logically consistent worldview that the Christian worldview produces, if it's understood right. And of course, the fourth one is pragmaticism. And I would say probably the first pragmaticist was somebody like David Hume, which wanted to abandon all metaphysics, right? How do you know what you know is what metaphysics is. How do you know? What's your appeal to authority to verify your epistemological outcome, right? If all knowledge is not necessarily true, then what's your sifting mechanism in order to find out what is true and what's not? That's where your metaphysical understanding of the world came from. Well, he said all metaphysic books should be consigned to the flames. He wanted nothing to do with that. He only wanted to deal with what I see in front of me and how does it fill my refrigerator. Okay, so those four worldviews, think about this. They are a negation of not just Christianity, but the Christian God. That is a person. He's not a thing, a general divine essence. He's not a monad, like Pythagoras would say, that produces the dyad. That's the doorway into the world of forms and produces the triad. He's not a thing. He's a person. If he's not a person, it's just a thing, then that means there was no intention to create humans because willing something into existence is a byproduct of personhood. It's a byproduct of nature, but the nature of personhood is to have a will is the point. You can't have personhood and not have a will. So determinism is out the window with that worldview. So if you negate personhood, that means everything that we exist, that we see exist, and our existence isn't accidental. So how destructive do you think any one or the collective of those worldviews, how destructive is that going to be in a Christian society? We know how destructive it is. Look where we're at right now. The total abandonment of the necessity to maintain as guardians the continuity of our civilization. And now they want to do horrible things to our kids and change their identity, change what they were born as. They run amok. And it seems like everybody's standing around like a deer staring in the headlights and they don't know what to do. So even these atheists like Richard Dawkins, is my point, knows and recognizes and is honest enough to say, look, I don't believe in God. But if you don't want to see Western civilization be destroyed, you have to maintain Christian society, because Christian society is what produced the virtues where we can justify saying you shouldn't kill somebody. Well, an atheist, or let's just say a person that doesn't truly believe in some type of a punishment, he'll just say, don't kill anybody and get caught. That's a total different worldview. So these opposing worldviews are found within, like I said, the Immanuel Kant, the David Humes, the Baruch Spinoza, Nietzsche, just go on and on. All Schopenhauer I mentioned. These all lead to a nihilistic outcome. They speak like describing a cake or even drawing a cake, but they don't produce the cake. They themselves did not produce Western civilization. Yet they stood on the shoulders of Western civilization to critique it and try to redirect it. And so, even if not one of them, if you have somebody in an American experience like the American philosophy or Americanism, like John Locke, even he produces a contradictory worldview. He says there are no innate things. And the next minute he says you have inalienable rights, God given. Well, which one is it? If there are no innate things, there's no such thing as inalienable rights. Because inalienable rights presuppose they are part of your human nature, especially when you also espouse within your philosophy that there are no innate things. That's what innate means. So that's where we realize there has to be a better answer on how to fight back against the intentional deconstructionism going on, not just with our culture, but when you have whack jobs going out calling for white replacement, white demographic replacement, like what Owen Benjamin was caught saying in this past week or so. Hurry up. Somebody please hurry the process. I thought we were getting rid of these people. It's talking about us. And his hand got caught in the cookie jar where he opened his big mouth and he just exposed his entire agreement with the process. Right? So why is there not more being done? Well, like I said before, every concept has to be known and understood within multiple other concepts. It's contextual. And that's why a form of politic also will manifest differently from one country to another. But it still should possess the same nature. That nature doesn't change. Its temperament may be different when, say, a nationalistic worldview or politic is manifested in Spain as opposed to Italy, as opposed to Britain or America. But it's still the nature of it. And the nature should be fight back and survive. Apologetically, yes, but by force and if necessary. But you're not going to have the conviction to do that if you yourself don't have access to these universal truths, these universal forms of understandings of things. Again, like Plato said, the katholikos, it refers to unchangeable principles that come down from the mind of God, the logos, and they're maintained in the scientific process of induction, because the scientific process uses induction, including political science, to have a certain level of predictability within your human experience. And the only way to do that is to understand that there is a uniformity in nature. And when we have that predictability and that uniformity of nature applied towards the inductive process, then you can draw a conclusion for a future time of predictability. Same thing with politics, not just biology. Okay, so I just get a little tired of hearing people screech and use the slogan of Christian nationalism where they don't understand how to describe that. They don't understand how to describe Christianity, Catholicism, what a nation is, what nationalism is, and how it takes on a different form that's not objective. It's not objective in its application. It should be subjective. It should very much be subjective. How can you be objective and laissez-faire about your survival and your family's survival? Therefore, you should be subjective. But your discovery of objective truths that exist in the mind of the logos are discoverable. How you implement them and protect them is subjectively, right? Avoid the neutral position is the point. Anybody want to give me a break talking for a minute and add anything?
Sure, I'll hop in. I mean, you know that we have a huge problem with people and embracing Enlightenment ideals, that reality is subjective. Like, I hear this a lot. Truth is subjective. Morals are subjective. As long as I feel like I'm a good person. You know, and that definitely went on to Protestantism. I'm not making that up. You can read it. Like, they embrace this. The change in the your relationship with God. And what does that actually mean? You know, and today we have people literally saying, "Oh, I'm not religious. I just have a relationship with God." Oh boy. You know, how many Catholics have you heard say, I'm Catholic, but oh boy, no, you're not
Right.
Catholic. Bye.
Right.
um,
I heard Williamson say something about that, how American Catholics are nothing more than Freemasonic Protestants that go to Mass.
yeah, I mean, it's true though. I don't know if you saw. I only saw a clip of it. I've hated him since day one. But Richard Spencer, again, always just a liberal. That's what he always was. But I guess he was on Tim Pool, and like the whole time he's just talking about liberalism. And how many Catholics have you interacted with that are liberals? I mean, especially here in the Anglosphere, there's no right wing. That doesn't exist. The closest you get to it is libertarianism, which what's the root of that word? Um, and like Trump, that's just his ego running. And then you get some Protestants and you get some Catholics. But let's take a look at who they are and the things that come out of their mouths. None of that's right wing. Center right at best, barely.
Right. Yeah.
There's a good talk as well. He's a Novus Ordo sort of theologian, Tim Gray. It's actually a pretty decent talk. It's called Religionless Spirituality. And so he is obviously countering Protestantism by and large, but he's also actually going after specific groups who are attacking Catholicism in regards to, oh, look what it says in the Bible, like all these man-made traditions, and they apply things in the sense that what Catholics do are just man-made traditions, not that the fact that Christ himself installed a church, etc. Whereas again, they remove the whole historical context of who Christ was talking to at the time. He was talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Particularly, they were instituting sort of a Talmudic at that point, man-made traditions. Those are the people he was actually calling out, not like his own divinely inspired church. So it's just back to the point, like, yeah, it's just a very good, maybe like hour, 20 minutes. And yeah, it's pretty normy, but it's largely safe in regards to just kind of refuting some of this spirit of, okay, well, I can believe in God and not believe in anything else. Like I have a personal relationship that only applies to you. But again, it doesn't apply to the universal body. My relationship with Christ is way different than yours. Your Christ says you can go and do degenerate things. Why is that okay when my Christ, it delves into that whole nonsense. We see it again. It finds its origins in Protestantism.
Right. And it's not to say that you can't learn something from a writing of a non-Catholic or even a non-Christian. Like a lot of us that have delved into philosophy have learned a lot from Plato, a lot from Aristotle, a lot from the dialogues of Socrates. Right. You've also learned what not to believe in and what not to follow and what is also insufficient. Was Pythagoras correct on the importance of numbers? Yes. It was his direct equivocation of numbers with the divinity correct? No. Was Aristotle correct with the importance of using the laws of logic? Yes. Does that mean his whole worldview was correct? No. So just because we share particulars, which is what this whole universalism and ecumenism of the modern day within fake Catholics, they promote an idea that because we have particulars, we must also want to believe in the same God. Therefore, we do believe in the same God. Therefore, it doesn't matter if we're in a different religion. We're just in a different vehicle going the same direction. That's a falsehood, right? Because again, those particulars come from a total worldview, and therefore you don't have particulars only. The particulars never stand on their own, right? So this whole idea of the use of subjective understanding, an objective understanding of things is so, and in my opinion, it's so misunderstood. I oftentimes go out and I say, there's no such thing as objective truth. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, of course, there's objective truth. What I mean is that everything that we possess, say, for instance, as a Catholic, it's within the subjective worldview that is not neutral and is self-protective. Therefore, it is subjective when you understand the truth. But what's the origin of that truth? The truths revealed, divine revelation, didn't come from the buildings of the Catholic Church. It came from God. Therefore, there's only one thing that's objective in the universe, and that's God himself. We are subjected to him. That's the contingent, subsistent relationship described by ancient Greeks. So that even I have a particular flavor of using those terms, subjective and objective, but there are self-evident definitions of those things. There's no such thing as having a personal experience. Well, there is a personal experience because nobody is on the same level of understanding and moral implementation and so forth. But that doesn't mean that, okay, well, you are told by God to not murder, but it's okay for me because I'm saved anyway, right? And I can't lose my salvation. So I'll make sure I don't scandalize people while I do it. So I'll do it in secret. Is that your subjective experience? You're off the hook. So,
And just quickly to jump off of that point, especially in regards to monism, it's to relate it to, a recent Catholic encyclical. Well, we'll say Pius X's Pacendi. He talks about this vital immanence that, we experience God, that God is present in everything. And your particular form of religion doesn't really matter because God is present. And so that is a pantheistic way of looking at the world, which obviously Catholicism rejects. But by and large, what you see in regards to some of the things espoused from the Novus Ordo is that you can experience God in other religions, whether that be Buddhism, Hinduism, etc. Look at some of these ecumenical actions that they've done over the past, 30, 40 years, primarily. And so it's not explicitly promoting pantheism, but implicitly by its actions. And I think that's just something to kind of keep in mind. Like Pacendi by St. Pius X does talk about this vital immanence that, these modernists are trying to espouse. Everything is the same. Why does it matter, right? But that's not, we know it does matter.
Yeah, again, this comes down to the particular and basic law of logic of identity that we were talking about before. What exactly do you mean by omnipresence? Is God omnipresence? Yes. Have we always believed that? Yes. But how do you not lose personhood by his omnipresence? Because he's the preconditioner of all things. He is not all things. He is the preconditioner of all things. That's what a lot of people miss. And like I said, just a little bit of knowledge and philosophy would help them understand that.
They don't even understand something as basic as free will.
Right. Right. I was getting to something regarding Socrates and Plato, and I was trying to move up the ascent towards a modern day. It's not that we can't learn something from some of these modernist philosophers, even if it's to avoid a particular philosophical argument that some of them end up abandoning later in life. I would say that there's a lot of guys in right-wing groups that worship Nietzsche, right? That study Baruch Spinoza, that at the beginning stages of their formation, they, of course, spurg out about John Locke. And when they figure out how infantile his worldview is, they abandon that. But just because these guys are early 20th century, maybe even nationalistic and fascist type of writers, they think what they're espousing is good. Spengler, perfect example. But does that mean that I would rather listen to somebody like Cornelius Van Til, who influenced Dr. Gregory Bahnsen? And Dr. Gregory Bahnsen and Cornelius Van Til are, well, I would say Van Til is probably singularly more integral in promoting the transcendental argument for the existence of God than anybody else in the modern era, even though these same arguments have existed since the ancient time in Catholic philosophy. How it's explained may use different terminology, right? Presuppositional apologetics, transcendental argument for existence of man. Now, he's wrong on exactly what Catholic theology and philosophy is. For instance, he describes as Thomism as saying, we believe as Catholics, because of St. Thomas Aquinas, that where reason stops, faith takes over. What's wrong with that statement? What's wrong with it is that reason and faith are univocal. They coincide from the ground upward into your reasoning. Now, does that mean everything he said is wrong? No, he gets way more correct than all those other Enlightenment era and German philosophers combined. He gets a lot more correct. And one of the things that's most important is talking about that precondition and God being the preconditioner of all things. So how can we know the uniformity of nature, and how is God involved in things without those particular things losing their particularity, like humans and everything else, angels? How is that? Well, he says, I don't need to know the particulars of all the things. When I observe things in nature, not naturalism, I am observing God's effect on nature that maintains their existence from his mind. Therefore, I think God's thoughts after him. Therefore, I'll have insight into all things. That's very Catholic, actually. So my point is that we can learn and have an overlap and a dialogue with certain people if we can get down to the nitty-gritty of these types of things. And if we understand something as profound as saying something like that, thinking God's thoughts after him helps you to understand that he's the one that maintains the uniformity of nature, that allows you to use induction and deduction and empirical data and pragmatic data. You can't justify using any of those, let alone incongruency with each other, unless you have that common principle of unity. The common principle of unity is God's presence on all things, formally, not substantially. So again, when we look at those other types of worldly philosophies, then we see that they are in direct opposition and actually are presuppose that they can't exist without the destruction of Christian Catholic principles and their implementation, which is why they seek to block them in their implementation into a politic, a worldview. Hey, we got a big boy guest here, restoring the faith. Anybody want to give him some talking ability?
Oh, hold on. Requested. I should deal with this, huh? Oh, IHSV asked to talk, and can I give it? I invited him.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I just wanted to touch on some things that you said. A couple things, just get some clarification. You're speaking about how you made reference to Plato and Aristotle, for example, and saying how, okay, well, we can, with Aristotle, we can use his laws of logic. That doesn't mean we buy into his entire worldview. There's a lot of things in his worldview that we can pull out because they were true, but you don't have to buy into the entire worldview. However, I can't remember exactly because you were saying this a little while ago, but you also said that worldviews, and it goes with the topic, have to be integral, right? So there is, I think there are certain subjects that are essential to a worldview, and they belong to that worldview as a particular. For example, if you're talking about Buddhism, the Eightfold Path would be particular to Buddhism, right? But if you're talking about the laws of logic with Aristotle, this is a universal truth that he discovered that don't particularly belong to his worldview, even though he discovered it. Since they're universal and they're a universal truth and they ultimately come from God, we can abstract that and pull it away from his worldview. And then that allows us to isolate it and adapt it as our own and incorporate it into our worldview, because only the Catholic worldview is the complete integral worldview. But really, those truths that were discovered and really put down by these pagans, they were discovering Catholic truths, not knowing it. And that's why St. Thomas can come along and um, baptize, in a sense, Aristotle's worldview and make it Catholic. That's how Augustine could take Plato and make it Catholic. So there are certain truths that we can discover from other worldviews without adopting their whole worldview itself. I just wanted to kind of like point that out. I don't know if you wanted to comment.
No, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic discovery and conclusion to come to, because, okay, so a Catholic philosopher will always seek the preconditions to establish the intelligibility of human experience. What is human experience? Everything. Everything is human experience. So when we interact with anything in life, since Christ has kingship over our person, then he has kingship and direction towards all of our human experience. And that's how we can have the intelligibility sought in those preconditions. Why is it wrong to murder? Because I'll go to hell, and my master tells me not to. Also, I'll destroy civilization because everybody else will think it's okay to murder, then it's chaos. Right? And that's where the particulars that come from a worldview that produces an incongruent worldview. Aristotelian logic creates an inconsistent worldview, an unintelligible worldview. But like you said, what he discovered is something that is self-evidently true, independent of his particular philosophy. That's the point. So it doesn't belong to him then. Just like the eternal truths that come down to us from the mind of the Logos are not possessory of our individual person. They come from God. They belong to God. So if God is the source of all goodness and justice and charity and everything else, then how can we ever say that we're the originators? This egotistical statement. Some of these guys get really full of themselves when they understand a little bit of philosophy, and they act like it's them figuring it out. No, God just simply revealed it to you, only for the reason of glorifying his name and bringing more people to salvation. And more importantly, what's been lacking, which is why we're discovering we need to have these types of conversations, a political protection, a collective bargaining power protection, and a legal way before it gets to the point where we have to physically do it, which is probably inevitable throughout history anyway, and will be again. Right? And that's where we're at. What is the intelligibility of defending ourselves rather than just saying, oh, just sit in the corner and do the rosary and do nothing? How can I stand before God in my judgment if I just stand there and do nothing when somebody invades my house and hurts my family? You guys are part of my family, though. How can I stand by and see you get hurt? So if I stand by and I don't do anything while something bad happens, that's part of the 9 ways of participating with somebody else's mortal sin and being accessory to that sin by not speaking out against it, denouncing it, and not agreeing with it. If you agree with it, the Catholic Church says you'll share in the punishment. So to me, I take that very seriously, and that's why I feel passionately it's so important to defend the Catholic faith, to defend Christian principles, and to implement them. No, don't just describe them, implement them and protect them. Is this Mike, or is this a ghost account? Is this Mike from RTF? Would you like to talk?
Good evening, gentlemen. It's just nice to hear people talking about important things. I just want to be a fly on the wall with my martini and my dog.
Absolutely, brother. Thank you for joining. Big Dog.
Hey, Mike, what's up, man? I'm the one who's friends with the Arab that brought you to the other platform. And anyway, last conversation we ever had, you were somewhere and you were talking about moving there, and I recommended Beef on Wick that you did not like.
The Arab. Everybody knows he's African.
I gotta bully him tomorrow.
So that is that sums up that statement there. How we seek the preconditions for the intelligibility of human experience. If one seeks that in all things, then you'll always come back to the source of your preconditions, and the all preconditioner, of course, is Christ, is God. Right. So there was really only one real section left I wanted to discuss real quick. So we talked about the philosophical origins and the multiple opposing. Actually, we talked about the multiple opposing worldviews. We didn't really talk about the physical or philosophical origins. So when we talk about the origins of Christian nationalism, and like I mentioned, when people say that, what they're really trying to convey is integralism, right? They maybe don't have the vocabulary or the knowing or a method of knowing of how to implement and verbalize how can we demonstrate Christian principles in a secular government, or even worse, in a government or a form of government like democracy that is specifically designed to deconstruct Western Christian civilization, right? So how do we do that when the entire political structure is so corrupt that it doesn't allow our participation or our protection by design? My argument has always been that we need to form our own entity outside of the structure itself. It doesn't mean political party. It just means that we have to have a form of a legal body of protection, of legal action, of something, right? Because if you're in the political structure that disallows your participation, what use are you going to do there? Does that mean you can't do anything at all? No, I think there should be something there. Somebody should be doing that, but it's not me. My intent is to help the younger guys, bring them up to an understanding of what it actually means to have a politic. It is inseparable from your Catholic worldview. You can't be Catholic and not be political, because politics, as Damascus pointed out, is the manifestation of your virtues and ethics into the public space. And if you can't even read the Bible in the public space, then you already live in a tyranny. And that has to change. And it can change. Human action, petitions, some type of a political demonstration of collective bargaining power does work. People just have to get organized about it. So again, going back to the origins, I really do think if one is trying to break down what Christian nationalism is, it really harkens to the issue of first attacking or just jumping onto the definition of Christianity. And again, like I said at the beginning, if you ask a Protestant, an Orthodox, a non-denominational, and a Catholic, what do you mean by Christian? You'll get all those different answers. And when you try to take their 4 different answers and implement them into a nationalistic politic, you're going to have, cats and dogs fighting. So there's only 2 ways of really moving forward if one is going to represent Catholic principles, and that is to have a Catholic entity that can cooperate as some form of loose alliance with a non-aggressive Protestant entity. But really, where are they? Every time I run into a Protestant, it is in a severe antagonism and calling Catholics pagan, calling this, calling that, and so forth. Okay, so can it be done? I think it can be, but your principle of unity has to be outside of specifically Catholic. Right? And the implementation of that politic, whatever administrative process it is, whether it be monarchistic, whether it be republic, which is a monarchy we've already established, whatever it is, it has to be compatible with Christianity. Communism is not compatible with Christianity. I don't care what Putin says. It's not. There are particulars of similarity, but the worldview of communism is completely incompatible with Christianity. And the only way to make it work is if you change it and it's no longer communism. So what are you talking about then? something totally different. There's no overlap with that system of thought, right? So, of course, the nationalism part means exactly that. It means that we cannot exist as a nation if the people governing the nation seek its demise and it's melting into an international. A baby can figure this out. It's obvious. But we're disallowed the participation in the process because of, like what I mentioned before, the four methods of power, of political power that are used are those four laws of power the mafia uses. The political structure operates as those four methods, right? Influence peddling, we know that. It's self-evident. Everybody knows it. Lobbies, whatever. They all act like gangs. Influence peddling, extortion, Epstein-style extortion, threats of violence and murder. Even the good kingdoms of the past have to use those types of methods in order to maintain its existence. Well, what are you talking about? Going to war is taking a life. It's not murder, but so is when a king pays a tribute to the Vikings to not invade France anymore. That's payola. It's influence peddling. So it's not to say that we need to go out and commit criminal acts. What it's meant to say is that you can't have this starry-eyed view that you're going to one day wake up and elect or choose a king, and he's just going to be imbued with God's spirit and then take over Washington or London or Berlin. The hard work has to be put in. The hard work has to be put in starting from the law of identity we talked about before. You have to clearly define these principles. And you can't do that while talking to somebody from the Novus Ordo, which their entire purpose is to pull you away from a definitive definition of what Catholicism is. Or just Christianity in general. If you don't want to be, we can't force convert you. But if you accept the fact that we're not pagan and you don't want anything to do with the namby-pamby evangelical or other Protestant sects, and you just observe from the outside, you're already losing your antagonism towards Catholicism. So I'm just saying, many people realize a return to Christianity is the answer. It should be Catholic because that is the most congruent worldview, but they've been cut off from its implementation as a political action. And that, again, that has to change. And you can't do it through a democratic process. You can't do it through modernism. You can't do it while also thinking you have to obey who's sitting in the chair, the papal claimant. If he says stand down and don't do anything, let it happen. Invite all the migrants from the third world. Invite everybody in. You should welcome them and be charitable. What about my family? What about my brothers? What does that account for? That's not acting as a shepherd. So where we don't have a shepherd, we as Catholic laymen and alliances and allies, we ourselves need to take that shepherding position regarding political protection. Otherwise, if you're just standing around saying, I'll wait to do something when we get a good pope, when we get a king that flies out of the sky, when we do this, when we do that, it's never going to happen. And that's it. So again, if people want to know what Christian nationalism is, the most basic elementary understanding of it would be the implementation, not just protection so I can do stuff in my own house like in the Soviet Union, but don't dare step outside. I mean the public demonstration and protection of Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox worldviews, as long as those Protestants don't conflict with ours. That's really what it is. That's all it is. How to do that is where the ethereal misunderstanding comes from. So when you have a Nick Fuentes or you have somebody else say Christian nationalism or monarchism, how do you expect to do that? What is your pathway to success in doing that? And what does that imply? So that's it. I want to flog a dead horse, but I think we kind of covered most of these issues regarding what to avoid. The only point of bringing up the opposing worldviews, the Enlightenment era, the German philosophers and so forth, they lead to a nihilistic dead end. People say, oh, you need to have some system of thought, some worldview to gravitate towards, and just go with it at that. Well, that's not true, because those don't produce intelligible worldviews. If you believe in Buddhism and you go through a reincarnation process, why should you do well in life if you end up just getting either reincarnated or going up to some other level of heaven that ends up getting annihilated as well? So all the gods and Buddhas and people all get annihilated at the end of the Dharma ending period within Buddhism. So I ask you once again, what does it matter if the saint is rewarded the same as the sinner? That is an unintelligible worldview. See, it will not do just to have a worldview. We have to have a worldview that comes from the same ingredients that bake the cake of Western civilization to return not to the Middle Ages. That's hell and gone. We're talking about just establish a level of order that is intelligible. We don't have that. And if people don't see a manifestation of some level of justice, that's when they revolt. That's historically what's always happened. Because if I don't see the leaders that are corrupt demonstrating justice, and they impose their version of justice on me, that's tyranny. That's anarcho-tyranny. And if those in control don't recognize that, I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I'm not advocating it, but I'm saying that in general, you have to have a certain level of justice. Otherwise, people end up becoming black-pilled. And that's where that pragmaticism comes into play. When you abandon metaphysics, you abandon religion, you abandon the Christian past, and all you care about is what fills my refrigerator, and you're pragmatic about things, and you see the world for what it is after abandoning a certain spiritual essence in your life, you become black-pilled. Because that's why the philosophical circles have always said that pragmatism leads to skepticism, and skepticism leads to nihilism. I become skeptical of everybody now, and I have no hope past this life. I put all my hope in this life, and when things don't work out well, I become skeptical. Everybody's a crook. Everybody's a thief. Black-pilled? Everybody is. Well, if everybody is, then you can't even trust your own family. Then you become nihilistic. I mean, do you see what happens when you cut off the metaphysical category from your entire life? You've lost the vetting process of the knowing process. Our knowing process is our Christian worldview. Our appeal to authority is the deposit of faith. If you place that into question because you're a deconstructionist and say, did Noah really exist? Did Jesus really exist? Did any of these people really exist? That's what the deconstructionists do. They get you to question everything, and they drag everything through the mud, like Mustache Man said. There's not anything they won't drag through the mud, while they themselves maintain their continuity of identity. So that's the double politic. They want you to embrace pragmatism and democracy, but they themselves do not give up on their own existence. That needs to change. So in general, when most people say Christian nationalism, I think that's what they're trying to convey. They don't know how to explain it fully, but that's what they're trying to convey. They want a sense of identity that's rooted into something eternal and that is specific to the identity of the Western man that evangelized the world. So I'll go ahead and stop talking. If anybody wanted to ask questions or contribute, I can stand for a little bit more, and then we can start wrapping stuff up.
I just want to, another thought occurred to me. Just wanted to make an observation. As much as we think philosophy is important, and it is, and the laws of logic and all these things, we know that the vast majority of people, and you kind of alluded to it before with the bronze class, silver class, gold class, a vast majority of people do not really concern themselves with the deeper things of philosophy. I wish they would. But people, I think, are moved more by psychology and by their own psychological, how do I put this? Psychological hangups, psychological whatever, right? So and whether that's based on past experience, based on emotions, it's still a very powerful thing. And I think the whole art of rhetoric, you can know logic, But the art of rhetoric is learning how to appeal to the masses and wrap up your package, wrap up what you're trying to express to them in a way that they can apprehend it, right? And a way that's going to appeal to them. And that's an art form in itself. So psychology is a very powerful thing. For example, look at what 2020 and COVID. You know what I mean? The reality of it is, a lot of people were very skeptical of it. I would say the majority of people were skeptical, even with all the mass hysteria, mass hypnosis, mass fear that was being pushed. So it was a big psychological operation. But at the end of the day, a lot of people still caved for psychological reasons. Only few kind of really held out till the end, depending on where you lived, right? It might have affected you differently, but that's just one example. Another example, when we talk about Catholicism and basically the state that the church is currently in. So we're talking about having a worldview and having it be integralist, and why can't we have any progress? Well, part of that is because of the state of the church is in. So can you really have things in common with a Novus Ordo? No, because it's not real Catholicism, and it's going to lead you to a worldview that is antithetical to Catholicism. Same with Protestantism. But even within traditional circles, because we're in an unprecedented crisis, there's a lot of infighting between different trad groups, for example. And part of that is because we don't have a unifying principle right now that can unify us. So this becomes an obstacle to unity as well, and an obstacle to presenting a unified worldview. Because if the SSPX, for example, takes a certain stand on a certain theological, let's say, position, and another group takes a much firmer stand on, no, that's wrong, you have to go with this. But the reality of it is, the vast majority of pew-sitting Catholics will maybe, and I know this from experience as well, will remain with a certain group over not necessarily logical reasons, because they might in certain areas consider themselves very logical. But the reality of it is, if they follow that like a computer did, without any emotion, without any other restraints holding them back, they might have to sacrifice a certain thing. They might have to do something that's uncomfortable, and at the end of the day, that is too hard for them to make that extra step. So I've made certain steps. I've gone through, and a lot of people go through the gamut when they first, let's say, discover tradition, for example. And it takes you move from this position to that position, and they all come with their own baggage, so to speak, right? They all come with their hurdles that you have to overcome. And I think sometimes, I just heard a good expression. I never heard it before, but Father Cicada said that geography produces your theology. And what he meant by that is basically the group that you have available to you, that's going to give you mass, is the group that you're going to gravitate to with their theological position. Even though maybe if circumstances were different, you might be able to explore other questions. Do you know what I mean? So now when you're transporting this into the political sphere, and how do laymen rally and create a worldview where we can unite, it becomes very difficult, because anything can kind of sort of derail that, at any given moment, because of this, basically just because of the state the church is in. Because at the end of the day,
Right.
we are laymen, and we don't have the power to end. Okay, let's end this debate. At the end of the day, that's basically what the Pope was. So even in times of the past, you had theological debates that in their time you had different schools of thought. But then once the Pope made an infallible declaration, he closed the door, and that's the whole beauty of papal infallibility. He said, no, okay, this is the correct view. Done. Now the debate's over. Now if you hold the contrary opinion, prior to that, you wouldn't necessarily have been a heretic, but after, now you are.
Right.
Okay, so
Right.
we can't do that. We do not have the means to do that anymore. So now you have all these groups that are endlessly infighting. So how do you overcome that? That's a problem.
Well, Yeah, and we've talked about that in other platforms and groups discussions several times. So popes in the past have been involved with the aristocracy, kings and emperors, but they didn't make those decisions. They would suggest decisions. They would be advisors oftentimes, but the final say so was on the other side of the double-headed eagle. It's still up to the king. Were there bad kings? There's a lot of bad kings that are Christian, that are Catholic. Were there bad bishops? I mean, what did Chrysostom say about the bishops and the priests? Right? So the idea that we are trying to find a principle of unity on theology is going to be a major mistake. And it's a major mistake almost every group that claims to be some type of Catholic layperson-led group has made. Now, it's not that theology is not important. I've challenged dozens of people, Protestant, Catholic, atheists, Jews, Muslims, Orthodox, to debate. Nobody wants to debate. I don't know what it is. They don't want to debate. Okay. And that was on theology. That was on geopolitics. That was on philosophy. Everybody wants to spurg and be an authority until they actually have to prove themselves. So there's going to be a difference of opinion even within religious orders. If we went back 200 years ago, you're going to find in the Catholic Church there were theological opinions that were different. And the church's position is that you can hold heretical or even heterodoxical theological opinions privately to yourself, and it may not affect your salvation, but that's up to you and God. But you can't notoriously go and spread them around like Nestorius. So why is it important to understand that? Well, it's important to understand that you can't, you're right, you cannot force people into theological congruency. That's not the job of the secular power that lays upon Catholic laymen, because right now there are still people that have descended from aristocratic lines in Europe that still live today and still claim to be Catholic, but they don't seek any power. They don't seek any justice, and they do nothing while their people are being overrun. So what gives? Either they're totally afraid or they're in on it. But the results are still the same. They do nothing. So it's up to us if we're going to defend our own families and friends. That's it. No, however that manifests is maybe different how it occurs in America and Canada and in continental Europe and so forth. But we can come to a definitive conclusion on things regarding what to do politically, what to do apologetically. For instance, if we're going to debate somebody, if we're going to have a group like this and then somebody wants to come in and do a debate, for instance, you can have levels of certitude regarding political argumentation. You can definitively say you can't be communist and Catholic. You could definitively say democracy is the bedfellow of Marxism, therefore democracy doesn't work. You can't be advocate democracy and what? And Catholicism. Now, we're not trying to espouse and run Catholicism. We're not trying to become the Pope or the priest. What we're saying is that if you're going to say you're Catholic and you want to protect Catholic principles with a politic, you can't leave Christ out of the equation when making your policy. Positive Christianity is what the Third Reich called it. So you can't be ambivalent. Marxism isn't just ambivalent, it was antagonistic and sought to crush out all of Christianity. And it still does today in different forms. So I have to disagree that I do believe we have access to the forums, as what was said by Plato. We do have access to the forums. What you're saying too is also correct, though. On the other hand, though, that not everybody needs to know about these particulars, but most people aren't going to come into a space and they're not going to go on Twitter and they don't get involved. So many of these discussions are meant for people that seek true answers and want leadership so that they can themselves disseminate out some basic principles from that general conversation, that general worldview, right? And they themselves also can become leaders, even if they lead nothing now at this present moment, but leaders in the sense that it helps it be more fortified in your certitude as a father, as a Catholic layman, and as a friend to others that may be in despair, and you're there for them, but also by spreading these principles, these unchangeable principles from Catholicism. How many Catholics are out there that are like having a bad time and they're black-pilled? That just means that they've lost sight of certain things regarding the faith. All of us go through that. But it always occurs at the same time when one loses sight of the general picture of things. Cornelius Van Til would say that a lot. What is the picture of knowing? What is the picture of things? That's something a little bit different than worldview. Your picture of things is to understand how you play into the general worldview itself, not the worldview. Like, it's impossible for you to consume all of the deposit of faith and read every volume and be a Dominican, a Benedictine, a Norbertine, a layperson, want to become a priest, also have kids. You can't do everything. So it's not that you're not Catholic because you're not doing everything every position in the Catholic Church does. You're Catholic because you play your role in the picture of things. Right? So that's what we have to be realistic with. Too many guys are running around trying to be theologians and own, which is really easy to do, people that attack the Catholic faith. But if you spend all your time doing that, you can't do anything regarding boning up on how we can be more politically adept. And that's what happened in 2020. Everybody, including myself, heard for years all these guys that were Patriot Movement guys, all these guys that are Second Amendment guys, all these guys that are libertarian, take the republic back, everything. And when the government shut everything down, where did they go? Oh, we're the most armed citizenry in the world. We have millions of rifles and billions of rounds of ammo. They're not going to try anything. You didn't do anything. Nothing. And why? It doesn't matter why. What matters is, what can we do? Now I can answer why they didn't do it. It's because they believe in those worldviews that I was discussing before.
Yeah, I agree.
They don't know what to do next.
I agree.
They don't know what to do next. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. I think the main reason, because of all the talk sounds good when it's on a meme, when you're trying to, like you said, own somebody on the internet. It's easy to put that up, but when stuff hits the fan and you have to act, and you've grown up in a comfortable culture where you've never actually done anything difficult, okay, but now you actually really have to do something that doesn't involve putting up a meme. That's different. That's one aspect, but that doesn't apply to everybody, because there were people that, let's say, maybe did, they had, let's say, the virtue of fortitude, but where they failed on their worldview, and this is a particularly Americanist worldview, which comes from the Enlightenment, is this radical individuality, right? And because of the radical individuality, all that does is it breaks down any sense of culture or even nationalism, because nationalism is based on a nation, and a nation is a group, a collective of people. It's not you sitting in your house. But if you're a libertarian, at the end of the day, it's just me with my gun sitting in my house. So you can talk the talk about, oh, the government's bad, government's bad, government's bad. But guess what? At least the government's organized. And if you're not organized, you are going to get overrun. I don't care how you talk. You can have all the guns in the world, but if you're not organized, you're not going to be able to implement any sort of force. Period.
I'm glad you said it, because that's what I was getting to. Because they believe in all these Enlightenment era philosophers that promote individualism and the autonomy of man. Because when you abandon metaphysics, which is your appeal to authority, your method of knowing in the Catholic worldview is, when you have a question, you go to the deposit of faith. Now, you can ask your priest, but you don't need that. You have a phone, you have a laptop, and you have access to the entire deposit. 1,000 years ago, you'd have to ask your priest because he was educated and the only one in town, most likely. So we have direct access to the deposit of faith that can define things from a Catholic answer, right? And when we see a demonstration that the autonomy of man is the only thing that's left, because they've eliminated the two other branches of philosophy, metaphysics and ethics, then your epistemology is all that's left. And their general body of knowledge, gnosis or Gnostic, their pursuit of Gnosticism really has ended. And it's kind of sad because at least in the era of the 50s and 60s and 70s, intellectuals were still trying to justify examining objectively Marxism, communism, John Locke, just any type of philosophical worldview. They were still looking. They've given up. All they do now is run to Epstein Island scams now. That's all they care about. So they're not even pursuing any intellectual answers, even if it's against Christianity. They just want to play. They're the Epicureans, and that's it. I mean, Epicurus was the greatest influence on all the modernist philosophers, even Leibniz, right? The creator of calculus. He was a great philosopher too. He lived around the same time as Kant and Hume and all these other guys that just really egotistically wanted to come up with a new perspective of a world that was outside of what the established Catholic worldview was. To an extent where Catholics, as I see it, when was the last time a great Catholic philosopher emerged? You can't just go straight back to Thomas Aquinas, right? It just shows you, anybody that's ever read objectively without embracing the whole worldview. If you've read Mein Kampf, you know for sure when Mustache Man was saying that how often is it that only a single great man emerges from society, like Frederick the Great, he said, for instance. Every great man only emerges every 500 years. But you don't need great men to do some of these things. This is not require a mega man. And it's not complicated. Survive. That's all you guys got to do is survive. But survive together. And this distrust amongst Catholics, distrust amongst Americans, Europeans, it's really shocking. It's not the same everywhere, but on the whole, there's a certain level of distrust because of all these things that we've known about and talked about. White guilt, taking the entirety of all of human history in the West and laying it into one group of Holocaust guilt. And then that buries all of us into a position where we can't even be proud of anything we've done ever. That's beginning to lift. People are realizing that, oh yeah, many people want to wipe us out and displace us and hand over our inheritance. What happened with this great American experiment with property rights? If property rights exist and somebody comes and hands over our inheritance to people that don't belong here and they receive that stolen good, is that not also participating with stealing? Yes. So property rights goes right out the door. So even those that promote Americanism, libertarianism, constitutionality, protected rights, they don't even believe that anymore. But I look at everything dialectically. Wherever there's an advantage, there's a disadvantage. As they wane in the belief of the American constitutional experiment that they don't commit themselves to, that's less of an object that they'll hold on to, so you don't have to steal it and take it out of their hands. They're just letting it fall to the ground. They're giving up. So there's an opportunity there. The opportunity is a return to something more cohesive, logical, meaningful, virtuous, and has the strength to keep a man, even when unpaid, in the fight to the death. Something a paid army can't do. So that's my hope. My hope is that more people realize that, look, and I mean this, you cannot be force converted to Catholicism. So whatever moron promotes that idea to you, that's a fallacy. That's a mortal sin. You can't do that. Okay. But even if one doesn't want to convert, if you actually practice the principles of the Western worldview, you're already practicing a Christian worldview. We know that ancient Greece and Rome were precursors to Christian Rome. But you don't experience pagan Rome. You experience the byproduct of Christian Rome, okay? The worldview you exist in today is a removal of the Catholic monarchies and a lowering of the implementation of the power of the ecclesiastical authorities. But you're still enjoying the benefits of a created world, the Western civilization that created everything. You're still experiencing that. That came within the bed of the Catholic worldview. It gave a principle of unity across all of continental Europe. Were there wars? Yeah, there was wars, but in the most, there was huge periods of peace and prosperity. How do you think someone like Mozart came about? Or Beethoven? Or Michelangelo? Or the gorgeous cathedrals and castles and everything else that is the grand architecture of Western civilization in general? How do you think that happened? If they couldn't do that if they're at constant war and they're chasing tail all the time. There's civilizations that don't do anything, including they can't get out of a grass hut because all they do is chase tail in their off time. Only we have temperance of the passions to spend that time in creative pursuit of something greater than ourselves and demonstrate that through art and architecture. Only we've done that. Well, anybody would have done that, but you didn't. You didn't. But pagan Rome, pagan Rome took their prisoners and fed them to lions in a Colosseum, and everybody cheered by the tens of thousands. We don't do that. That's not Christian civilization. Therefore, you're not experiencing pagan Rome, you're experiencing Christian Rome. So whatever a modern version of that is, to return to some type of a normalcy and instead of telling us that if we don't convince our children to change their gender, then we're going to take your kids away. It's insanity. But we can only say it's insanity from a Christian worldview. If you're from a naturalist worldview and you believe that Christianity is dumb, it's made up, I only want to experience the divinity through nature. Well, I've said this before, I don't see divinity in nature. I see kill or be killed. I see brutality. I see the victor takes the spoils and murders and executes everybody that gets in his way. Why wouldn't he? Because if he can get away with it, then he should. That's what all the animals in the natural worldview do. So how is it unjust? There's no such thing as justice in nature. Right? That's a Christian worldview. So anybody else want to add something before we...
Yeah, real quick. So one of the biggest problems, well, first of all, Christian nationalism boils down to big tent. And I understand rhetoric. I understand that you want to be many things to many people. But that's where things fall apart, right? I've been around a while. I'm an activist. The most powerful word in the English language is an N-word, but it's not the N-word you think it is. It's no. No, I'm not doing that. No, that's not okay. It's no. And you have to say no and stick by no. Nobody wants to do that. They want big tent nonsense. And it's not good. And that's why all of this continues to fall apart. Right. So, they don't even want to define in-group and out-group. Horrible.
Right. And like I said, I think it's possible to be part of a coalition, but you first have to be, you have to have your collective identity, in-group preference clearly defined, with a collective bargaining power and ability to defend yourself apologetically and physically. And that's the only time that you can go into the public space, make a coalition with others, and survive the political landscape. But yeah, like you said, that's the whole premise of this conversation, is that, it's you said it in a more colloquial term, that it's big tent. They don't want to define it because they're afraid of offending people. We're in a position now where we're saying, look, we can work with you if you're not Catholic, but not if you're going to be one of these Spurg low IQ fruitcakes that goes out there every 2 seconds and says, "Oh, Catholics worship these statues and they worship the dead and they're just pagans and blah 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 blah." I mean, do you want to go extinct or not? That's it. That's the end
And
result.
this is what the. Sorry, I didn't mean
No.
to talk over.
No, I'm just ranting and raving, but that's it. I mean, it's
no, I mean me too, though.
Mhm.
Like we talked about this earlier. Oh boy, the Catholics I've run into, right? Like, let's take away the Protestants, the pagans, whatever the story might be. Dear Lord, help us.
Sorry, I think Patrick wanted to say something. Does he have the ability to talk? I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention.
I invited everybody to speak in the chat as far as I know.
Oh, yeah, I think you have to respond, Patrick. You have to reply to it, and then you can. So I'm with you, Matt. I totally agree. Getting definitive on what you mean by, I don't even like the term Christian nationalists. I only like a little bit better Catholic nationalists, but it's only to convey something that people understand. I would prefer to describe the political philosophy of Catholic integralism, but hardly anybody knows what that is. So it's like, but that's not the politic. You can call it the blue sky party. It doesn't matter what the party is. And what their name is. What matters is what is your defined political philosophy. It would definitely have to be Catholic integralism. Can that manifest in a dictatorship? Can it manifest in a monarchy? Can it manifest in a republic? It can manifest in all those things. It can. All right. So I didn't...
Yeah, I don't know what's going on. I've definitely invited everybody in chat.
Okay. That's
to
fine.
speak. You should see a button down there to speak. Like, I don't know.
Give you another minute, and if you don't want to talk, that's fine. Catch on the next one.
When I first joined, I have a little mic button, and it had me as a listener. When I hit the mic button, it says I had to request to speak because I was only a listener. And then so I had put in a request, and then I was allowed, and then I was able to speak. So just on my little thing of this Patrick is labeled as a listener right now. So if that makes any difference.
Right. Everybody's labeled as a listener until they receive the permission, and then they got to reply to the send out. Okay. All right. Well, if anybody didn't have any other questions or something they wanted to add, overall it was a good first spaces, and we're going to definitely do more of these. I hope that we can do them once a week, if not every other week. But we really do have to try to get people up to speed. It's true they don't have a thirst for philosophy, let alone political philosophy, or let alone politics, but they're already doing those things. They're already participating with those things. If you practice an ethic, you're participating with philosophy, right? And I am of the belief that Catholicism is philosophy. It's not just philosophy, but it is philosophy, as Damascus said. So you're already using the metaphysical method of knowing as the church. And so therefore you're also practicing philosophy. So, yeah, he said, yeah, he requested to, yeah, well, we sent the invitation out. Sorry.
I've tried here. Like, I keep sending him invite to speak. I don't see any requests. I don't know.
It's all right.
Space.
Yeah, it's no worries. So yeah, the end result is that people have to have a certain. They can't keep saying, "Why do we keep losing? Why do we keep losing?" Like in 2020, and then refuse to improve their intellect, improve their understanding of the faith and politics. Right? It's like saying, "I can't hit a target downrange at 100 yards. I don't know why. Did you adjust your scope? Did you drop it? Did you check and make sure your screws on your scope mounts are locked down?" Oh, I don't want to do that. I don't want to be bothered with that. I just want to do it. I just want to bang, bro. That's a 80 IQ response. And you know what? If you just want to be part of the bronze class, and that's the misnomer of Plato's Republic, and that the bronze class doesn't exist. He believed everybody could be lifted up in an idealistic worldview up the ladder and ascent of groups. Almost nobody breaks out of the guardian group, but you can take somebody that's totally degenerate and bring them up so that they're part of a guardian class with some valor, some honor, right? You can bring people up. That is true. So he's not wrong about that. They have to want it, though. Right. And I think people are finally, like the Western man typically does, I think they're finally getting the point that things are really bad. So I'm either going to kiss my ass goodbye or we're going to fight back. And really, people don't fight back until their comfort is taken away and they're really in dire straits and in danger. So that's where we're at.
Well, brother was talking about this earlier, right? So we have talked about this, right? Knowledge is that which is passed down to you, right? Wisdom is that which you've learned by experience, and all wisdom is learned through suffering, right? Like all the philosophers talk about this. That's definitely true. We have lost knowledge. Knowledge is gone. So it's wisdom that exists today, or street smarts, I guess, in modern parlance, but not really. I hate to say this, but that's the only way people learn. Like if you saw the BLM Summer of Love, right? How many people do you know? Like that's very different, by the way, from what went on in the 60s, 70s, 80s. They were burning down Main Street this time. You know, wasn't watch riots, wasn't burning down some black neighborhood or whatever. Main Street. And you all saw what happened. How many people do you know that after it stopped went right back to the way they were? That's the thing I struggle with the most.
Right.
Like, is that what we have to have? Does it have to get that bad and just stay that bad forever before somebody's going to figure it out?
Yeah, apparently. But again, the assumption that everybody...
Patrick, real quick, buddy, like, I'm going to send you a link again. I don't know what's going on, bro. I'm trying.
Yeah, just go ahead and try again. Said he requested on the... Okay, yeah. Patrick, yeah, go down to the space window. In the bottom left-hand corner should be the microphone. If you click on it, there's the request, but also Matt should have sent you, or already did send you, something that you could respond to. Yeah, it is a bit simpler on Telegram, isn't it, guys?
Probably hard, Patrick.
All right. What I was going to say, Matt, is in general, I think the biggest mistake is to look at everybody and think we can make them all into philosophers, make them all into, oh, Cletus wants to talk to, make them all into soldiers, make them all into this and that and the other. Again.
Hey, hate to say it, but not everybody gets to be an astronaut.
Right. Cletus, where am I missing the options here? Where's my options? Space settings, speakers. I'll just say everyone. Who can speak? Everyone. Try again, guys. everyone. Yeah,
I've been on other spaces where they've had these problems.
yeah. Like you can't change the settings or
I,
anything in it after you start. It's gay.
yeah, like I'll leave. Re-add me as co-host. We'll see what that does.
Yeah, but you guys were able to give it to me. When I started, I was a listener.
I know.
And then I requested it, and you gave it to me.
Right. Yeah, my settings are which speakers to allow, and it's not even allowing me to go to any other settings now. Yep. Show captions, report this space. Yeah, there's no other settings that are appearing for me now, so something's happened.
Oh no, we got a Fed. That's what it is.
Probably. Hey, say hi to Jagger. Yeah, I don't know, but I do have to go in a minute. So, dang it. I mean, I'm sure if we shut it down and then restarted another space, like you're raising your hand, I can't go to any other setting. I have the option of end, space settings. I go to space settings, and it only shows me speakers. Who can speak? Current speakers. I click everyone, it doesn't take. And I have no other settings available now. So let's try this again. Space settings. Nope. Sorry, guys. We'll do another one soon, and everybody can get in. Next time, I'll just say everyone and kick anybody out I don't want to hear. Servium, did you want to close with prayer so we can wrap up? Or was it Chris Reeve? Yeah, he was going to do close.
Yeah, I'll do it. Because he opened. In nomine Patris et Filii Spiritui Sancto. Pater noster, qui es in celi, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua sicut in cielo et in terra. Panem nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis debita nostra, sicut et nos dimittimus debitoribus nostris, et ne nos inducas in tentationem, sed libera nos a malo. Amen. Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et benedictus fructus ventris tui, Iesus. Sancta Maria, Mater Dei, ora pro nobis peccatoribus, nunc et hora mortis nostrae. Amen.
Amen. Great talk, you guys. We'll catch you next time. I'll go ahead and end it here. Have a good night.
All right, brothers. Later.